Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's virtual program of the Commonwealth Club of California. I'm Dr. Londe Ajose, Senior Policy Advisor for Higher Education to Governor Gavin Newsom, and I'm pleased to be your moderator for today's program on the future of higher education. The Commonwealth Club has, of course, shifted from in-person programs to virtual events, and the club is grateful for the support of its viewers. Please visit commonwealthclub.org to learn more about the club's programming. We also want to remind you to submit questions via the chat room next to your screen, and I'll get to as many as possible later in the program. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's program and our guest, Dr. Mary Marcy, President of Dominican University of California, member of the Commonwealth Club's Board of Governors, and author of the book, The Small College Imperative, Models for Sustainable Futures. Dr. Marcy is the 9th president of Dominican University of California, serving since 2011. Her research focuses on higher education innovation and transformation. As the person responsible for shaping Governor Newsom's higher education policy agenda, I'm excited to talk with Dr. Marcy today. The governor's agenda remains focused on preserving access, improving affordability, and meeting the state's needs for a skilled and educated workforce in ways that promote greater equity. Before the challenges of 2020, most of higher education was already facing intense demographic, financial, and cultural pressures. And now, with the likelihood of some online learning remaining a part of the college curriculum, even post-pandemic, what does the future hold for higher education? What questions should students and families be asking institutions as they prepare for return in the fall? Will higher education as we once knew it return? Or has the pandemic fundamentally changed how students will experience college? Today, we're going to discuss the rapidly changing state of higher education and how colleges are preparing to meet the needs of students for generations to come. Welcome, Dr. Marcy. Dr. Marcy,
thank you for that one. Sorry, it was just a thank you.
Delighted to be here with you. This is long coming. We tried to do this last year just before the pandemic started, and I'm so delighted that we have an opportunity to do it now. I was thinking that we'd start by talking a little bit about the book, and I'm wondering if you could just share with our viewers what encouraged you, what inspired you to write this book?
Sure. You said we were trying to do this before the pandemic hit. The book was like this one of those perfect bits of timing related to the pandemic. It actually was released on, I think, March 9th or something last year. So, perhaps there was a little bit of noise in the system besides what was going on with the Small College Imperative. But what's interesting, and I think what's important in thinking about it now, is that the questions raised there, as you suggested, are continuing to be relevant and perhaps even more relevant as we come through the pandemic. Issues around financial sustainability, access to college, increasing diversity of students, those are crucial issues for every family, every community, all over the state and all over the nation. And I really thought about the book as a way to understand, embrace, and think about how higher education is changing and needs to change to respond to some pretty significant shifts in the larger ecosystem, the larger environment. And specifically talking about small colleges, because I think one of the great strengths of American higher education, and certainly of California higher education, is its diversity. And in this case, I mean diversity of types of institutions. So you have a great community college system, a great state college system. We've got the UC system, lots of specialized institutions, and some really independent institutions. The ecosystem matters. And the idea is that there are great options for all students. The challenge is if part of that ecosystem is under great stress or falls apart, we lose the opportunity for higher education to do what it does best, which provides an avenue for personal and social transformation. I'm at an independent college, a small college. I know that arena well. A lot of institutions were under stress, and I wanted to say, what can make us successful? And how can we serve students and families and our missions more effectively? So that was really the genesis for the book. And I would say, like many things, as we come out of the pandemic, the questions that I had going in are probably more rather than less relevant today.
Interesting. When I read the book, I was really interested. I went to a small college myself, And I was really interested in this idea of a typology. And you lay out a typology for how these small colleges are structured. Can you talk about how useful a typology is to the average student or family? And tell us a little bit about where you'd place Dominican within that.
Sure. It's a great question. So I actually started thinking kind of, internally, but it's about students and families and how they look at college. It's really important to understand that even within a subset like independent colleges, it's not one size fits all. And it's not as much as we talk about it, the athletics team or the beauty of the campus. They're really very different institutions. So on the one end of the spectrum that I created the typology is the classic liberal arts college, right? Highly residential. You're going to study the core liberal arts and sciences. You're going to get a terrific education. You're going to hopefully become a better citizen and a better member of society as a whole, as well as have great avenues to employment. That's the classic liberal arts. The challenge for small colleges is that's not by itself easily sustainable for a lot of institutions. And so there's been a lot of innovation going on. We mentioned in the introduction, I know part of your focus is also saying we need to be responsive to workforce needs. The liberal arts can provide real avenues to workforce, but it's obvious to everyone how that fits. And some places have reinvented themselves a little bit. Other end of the typology, much more online, much more just-in-time types of education, much more market-driven. Lots of spaces in between, but those are kind of the. And if you're a student or a parent thinking about where you go to college, you need to understand where the institution fits in that broader spectrum so you know not just what it feels like on campus, but what is it what will my experience be when I'm in college here? And what does that prepare me for when I'm done?
So are you thinking that student preferences for college have changed, or is it that the institutions, the liberal arts model just hasn't kept pace with the enormous pressures and the enormous changes of society as a whole in terms of how it's preparing students?
It's a great question. I think the liberal arts is actually fairly misunderstood. If you look at the data, if you get out 5 or 10 years from graduating from college, it really doesn't matter that much what you major in. And in fact, a lot of students from liberal arts backgrounds do as well or better if you measure it in, quote, return on reinvestment, like salaries. So students from liberal arts colleges who have majored in the liberal arts do extraordinarily well. Having said that, we have become very proficient at measuring higher education based on return on investment. And it is a big investment, clear. It's a big investment for the state. It's a big investment for the family. So what's our return? And that tends to track more for many folks to what's my job going to be when I get done? And how sure can I be that will happen? So I think that one of the challenges has been us in independent colleges is to be able to kind of put the breadcrumbs out and say these are all the options that can happen as a result. So one of the ways that some liberal arts colleges have started to reinvent, it's certainly something we've done at Dominican, which with really good results, is focus less on what are you majoring in and more on what's your hands-on student experience. So at Dominican, every single student has some type of active community engaged learning. Every student has a digital portfolio they can take with them to a job or apply to graduate school with. Every student has a mentor. Every student has a capstone project. So it's really hands-on, and you can then tie it directly to here are the skills I have, here are the things I know how to do, and that can lead to all kinds of jobs. And so we're less interested in what you're majoring in and more interested in creating a particular kind of experience. Now, I say that because I know Dominican really well, but there are a number of institutions that are really refocusing around that kind of hands-on, engaged, active learning as a way to tie students' experiences to life beyond campus.
And so when you think about that, the Dominican example in particular, which I love, I've been a strong advocate of, a digital portfolio for a long time. because I think measuring quality in higher education becomes somewhat elusive, and a digital portfolio actually shows a student's work, right? I'm wondering, though, as you think about where that fits in the typology, is that how standard that is for our liberal arts college, and what that means in terms of kind of your typology and what it means for the kind of experience a student will have on those different campuses. Obviously, if you're online, you're having a very different kind of experience than a small residential liberal arts colleges. But for some of your other, models of how colleges are evolving, is it that the intimacy that we expect to see? Is it that hands-on experience at most of them, or does it really vary quite widely?
It varies a lot. It varies a lot. And I think that one of the challenges for small colleges, we all say, well, you're going to get a very personalized experience. Well, yes, you will. Absolutely. But that by itself doesn't make a great education. And so the places that have adopted some type of educational model built on what we call, because we like jargon, high impact practices, things that make a difference to students when they're in college, institutions that have adopted those and said, every student's going to have this, are the ones that are making a difference. And I can give you a pretty interesting data point, because it's one of those, you remember the I think it was Sesame Street, wasn't it? It was like, one of these things is not like the other. So about a month ago, some data from the Department of Education came out that said, what institutions in the country are most effective at getting students access to high-paying jobs soon after graduation? And it was controlled by major, so it wasn't like every place was listed as a computer science institution. And one of the things that came out of that is the top 10 institutions tend to be private colleges with a strong liberal arts core. What's even more interesting is it's this fascinating mix of places you'd expect and places you wouldn't expect. So number 1 is Harvard, number 9 is Stanford, and I got to say this, number 10 is Dominican. Right? Wow. For salaries post-graduation. And it's because of that kind of engaged learning. Now, there's a ton of other, I got to give our colleagues too. Santa Clara is there in the top 10. There's a lot of institutions that are in this small private college mode that are doing extraordinarily well for student outcomes. And it tends to align when they've had a highly engaged student experience as an undergraduate.
Great. When I think about small colleges, I think about how they fit together with what we know to be the student population in California. We have a lot of what I think of as being next generation students, underrepresented, first gen to college, Black, Latinx, Indigenous. And one might assume that they might find a deeper sense of community at a large institution simply because they might find more people like them. Can you talk about how and whether, I guess, small colleges are the right place for our diverse student population in California?
Yeah, that is such a great question, and completely understand one saying, well, guys, let's go to a place where there's 50,000 students. I'm going to find my tribe, right?
Right.
I think that people will be very surprised, actually, at the profile of students at most independent colleges in California. So, I know my example, we're about 2/3 students of color, most from underrepresented students. About 1/3 of our students are the first in their family to go to college. That's not unusual. That's actually typical of independent colleges in California. Mm-hmm. I would say that, so the question then is, how do you, okay, so you have, that's like diversity 1, right? You have diversity in the room. What do you do with it? I think the question that families and students should ask isn't big enough to find my people, but what is the experience of diversity, equity, and inclusion on this campus? And one of the things I try to profile in the book is the places that have been successful at adapting to a changing student demographic are the places who very intentionally said, demographics are changing and we need that. So don't wait for it to happen. Be intentional about what are best practices for this profile of students. How do we meet those students where they are? And I would say that's particularly true for first generation students who are still learning college. So it's not that these students can't do well at large institutions, they absolutely can. It's not that they can't do well at small institutions. I think it's the questions that families and students ask that's important. And I think that we focus on, the other thing I'll say about the question of where you fit is that we focus so much on access to college and getting in. And that's a huge step in the first one. But the next series of questions has to be, what happens when I'm there? And what does it prepare me for later? Getting in is not the prize. Getting in is the first step.
Right.
And the rest of these conversations are the crucial ones, I think, for student outcomes and student success.
Well, I'll just say that I have a high school senior, so we are asking that question right now as the college letters come in.
You're supposed to know everything in your job, right?
Oh my God, I got to tell you, I had no idea it was going to be this stressful. I wanted to talk a little bit about colleges in the pandemic. Those of us here in the Bay Area sadly heard about the announcement at Mills College that they'll be making a transition. And I'm wondering if you're optimistic about the role of small colleges, especially given the pandemic and how the last 12 months has changed the prospects for small colleges.
Yeah, I would say I'm kind of a hard-headed or pragmatic optimist. I think that the work that small colleges and independent colleges do is so crucial and so central to positive student outcomes that in a general sense, I'm optimistic. I'm also, really sobered by, Mills, by our good colleagues at Notre Dame, Dana Muir last year. I'm sobered because I think we were struggling, as you mentioned, facing really tough challenges financially and otherwise before the pandemic. And I think that the folks at Mills, I know and respect them there, and they did incredible work and valiant work to make things happen there.
Yeah.
One of the things I really respect is that they have great clarity of mission. So, in your question about, am I optimistic? It would be one thing if Mills disappeared. It would be much more tragic if that mission was lost. Right? And there's great focus there on continuing around women's voices and women's equity and social justice. And I think those are questions that a lot of small colleges are going to need to be asking. Do we need to reinvent our mission, or do we need to reinvent around mission? And you asked the question earlier about liberal arts colleges. Are they failing to adapt, or the liberal arts in general? And I think that's a question we all have to ask, is how do we adapt to be successful, but still great clarity on what's our purpose? Why does this institution exist, and what needs to continue to exist?
All right. Speaking of adaptation, last year, I thought it was remarkable to see every single college in the state of California pivot to distance learning in the space of 3 weeks.
Oh my goodness.
I was just like, wow, because it's a huge enterprise. It's a set of enterprises. I'm wondering how you think the pandemic is going to permanently change higher education. What should we be thinking about in terms of distance learning, and how will it change the student experience?
It's going to have a profound effect. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about this as you're looking at the landscape too. I will tell you that I know everybody can remember where they were, right? We were literally in a cabinet meeting on campus talking about if we have to go online for a while. And we had, I think, like 2 hours to turn things around and get the message out to everybody that we were going online like tomorrow. And here's the plan. Most of us, Dominican certainly included, I think saw, the metaphor I used was last spring, was like you're driving down the freeway at 70 miles an hour and you blow a tire. And so you put the donut on because that's what's in the truck, and it might get you to the next, the next stop, but it's not going to carry you through. So what's interesting about that is that most of us spent the summer really investing in trying to do this right for the fall. And so there's a lot of investment in online education. There's a lot of learning about what's working for students and what isn't. I know we're not the only institution that's been looking at student feedback and assessment and faculty feedback and assessment, saying what's important. So what are the outcomes from that? I'm going to suggest 2 or 3, and I'll bet you have some thoughts about this too. The first is that students very much miss the campus experience. But the campus experience is not the same as all of my learning takes place in the classroom, right? It's the total campus experience. It's being with their friends. It's getting to know people in and out of the classroom, adults in and out of the classroom, not only faculty. It's a total campus immersion experience that students want, and that's understandable. But they appreciate the greater flexibility of being able to do more things online, whether it's coursework or some of the other work that needs to happen. And they like the just-in-time aspect of pieces of it. So I think what we're doing, and I'm guessing a lot of other institutions, is saying, what did we learn? Which classes actually worked better online or in a hybrid format? Do we really, some trivial things, do we really need to have wet signatures on all of those pieces of paper? Or can we actually do a whole bunch of this through DocuSign? I think higher education is going to transform pretty significantly. But one of the surprising outcomes, and I've heard this from colleagues at institutions large and small, public and private, is that no one really sees this as everybody's now going to go online, or that's going to be the predominant form, because students so missed the collegiality and the relationships and the campus experience. So we're going to be more nimble. We're probably going to have more options. But I don't think we're going to all of a sudden all be virtual. That's my best read right now. But you spent quite a bit of time thinking about this question. So what do you think?
No, I think I would agree with you. I think that there will be, there's such deep desire to feel connected, beyond the little boxes that we find ourselves in. And I think that that faculty miss that connection just as much as students do. Especially those colleges that are residential. It's a huge part of the experience that students often choose to pay for, and they're making kind of a proactive choice about what kind of institution they want to be at. So there's so many ways in which the current environment doesn't fit those choices. At the same time, I think California could benefit from thinking about what role can distance learning play in helping us to think about innovation within higher education. I agree with you, there'll be increased nimbleness, but I think, I hope that there are faculty out there who are saying, I never would have thought that this actually might be, this might enhance my teaching and consequently enhance student learning. Right? It's about the teaching and learning piece. And I think that those questions are now being asked in ways in which they weren't being asked a year ago, and in ways in which we maybe assumed a year ago or 2 years ago that technology and this pivot that we've made could never have possibly had a beneficial outcome. And now we see that there are some silver linings. And I don't think we'll ever go to, the state will never go to a model where everything's going to be online, but integrating a little bit more of that actually could be quite beneficial. I've heard students talk about, asynchronous can be great for lectures because I can listen to the lecture, I can rewind, I can go back, and then I can complement that with a discussion group. Right. And I can do it on my own time. So there's some things I think that are opportunities that we should grab onto, especially if they could result in potentially more students having access to higher education.
Yes, the access question is crucial. And I think that, a lot of students, I know that the kind of mindset is every student is a kind of typical straight out of high school, middle class, upper middle class, et cetera. The vast majority of students now don't look like that old typical college student. Most of them work, among other things. And so if you're working in order to help pay for college or to help family, having some of that flexibility built in, but still having enough on-campus experience and relational experience so that you can have effective learning, I think is important. And I will say that, one of the interesting things that I think has come out of the pandemic, and I have to believe this is typical for most of my colleagues around the state, is that we are so terrified about having to do what we did last March again. We're building in much more flexibility for the fall because we don't know what the fall is going to look like, right? So we're actually going course by course and saying, first of all, to your question, was this better online, better in person, or should I be some mix? But secondarily, how do I create enough flexibility so we can adapt to changing public health protocols? in that process, we're getting all kinds of new information about how students learn effectively and how faculty teach effectively. Mm-hmm. And I think it's incumbent, if higher education can't be a learning organization, who can, right? So I think we're all kind of gathering the assessment from those experiences and thinking about, how do we build the future based on what we've learned. Mm-hmm. And there are some real surprises in there, including some of the classes, the liberal arts that we talked about at the beginning. Some of those classes are doing great online or partially online for exactly the reasons you said, because what they really want to have in person is discussion and not so much the lecture, et cetera. So that it may push us towards better pedagogy and more seminar style in person, for example.
Interesting. What safety measures are you all thinking about as kind of permanent measures as students are thinking about returning to campus?
Well, we're definitely saying students need to have the vaccine. Thanks to the good work of the leadership in California, we're going to have the vaccine available and our students need to have it. I don't see how we can bring the number of people to campus that we bring to campus beyond students without that level of safety. And students need to help protect each other as well. So that's very high on the list. We have also, kind of, as every place has, I think we've got all kinds of markers around campus about social distancing. Mm-hmm. I hope that a lot of social distancing can be reduced, but in the meantime, we can manage that and we can manage the masking and all of those things. I don't think we're going to go back to whatever normal was before. And I don't think where we're at now is normal. So how do we hold on to what's necessary for public health? And for us, the biggest issue is really vaccine, and then ongoing testing is needed. Mm-hmm. But that's a place where we're relying a lot on you all, actually, to help us know, what are the best guidelines. We know a lot of things. We are not public health experts, so so we're really relying on working closely with the public health folks to understand what we need to do.
Well, I will say that, I'm working right now with the California Department of Public Health, and we're looking at and we're developing guidelines for the colleges for the fall with an eye towards reopening. I think it is certainly the governor's and my greatest hope that everyone will be open for face-to-face education in August and September. A lot of that depends on the behavior, obviously, of Californians between now and then in terms of getting the vaccine, in terms of developing herd immunity, in terms of continuing to have a very rigorous approach to testing and probably pool testing, and thinking about what's the affordability model for all of that, because I know that does not come without significant expense. So that is in the works, but we're looking at all of the various items from housing and densities within classrooms to what needs to happen with college athletics to really ensure that we can allow students to have the best possible experience under the safest possible conditions. So,
yeah, the athletics is its own world, right? And trying to figure all of this out. You guys have actually been really amazing in helping us sort through that. And if we can, am I allowed to turn the tables at this point and ask you about some of your work on reopening higher ed?
Sure.
So not everyone necessarily knows that in the last academic year, since we always think in academic years, you've been leading the Recovery with Equity Task Force, which started, I think, last August. And the idea was, how do we build out of this and maybe not have all of the inherent difficulties and lack of equal access to educational opportunity while we do it. I'm thinking last August was really smart to say we're going to have a task force and we're going to have to put this together for an entire vision for the state of California higher education. So what made you think of that last August when the rest of us were just trying to figure out, is this 6 feet or not?
Well, thank you for that question. It's interesting because the idea actually germinated last April. And, I have the pleasure of chairing the Governor's Council for Post-Secondary Education, which includes, the president of the UC, the chancellor of the CSU and the community colleges, President Kristen Suarez from the AICCU, and many other individuals. And I was talking to a colleague, and at this meeting, we were watching just the enormous triage that was happening across every campus and system. And the conversation I was having with the colleague was, at some, there's a life cycle to crises, right? And we were in the immediacy of the crisis, but we knew that at some point in the future, things would return to normal or to the next normal, which is what I like to call it. Mm-hmm. And that actually embedded in the crisis was an opportunity to really rethink some of the what we took as fundamental features of higher education. And for me personally, I think we had a working or an operating definition of equity and how it functioned in January of 2020, and there was nothing predetermined about that, right? And so for me, I wanted to think about where could we think about the silver linings in this pandemic, and were there opportunities to reset how we understood higher education and how we thought about educational equity within higher education by bringing together, the sharpest minds who think about these issues, both in California and across the nation. And so with that, the idea of the task force was born. We had the endorsement of the council, and we had individuals from all across the country who focus on educational innovation and equity, as well as representation from all the higher education segments. Here in California, we had stakeholder voices in the form of former student leaders and faculty. And we really brought those individuals together to try and chart a course for understanding how we wanted to define educational equity here in the state of California, and what that would mean, and what it means for our institutions to evolve, since we're looking at a higher education system now that is going to be much more nimble. And so that was where the idea came from.
Wow. So you had a deep dive into pre-pandemic, pandemic state, and then said, how do we come out of this? So I'm interested in if you said you had a working definition of equity, but not set. When you dove in, did you have any big surprises? Were there things that you've learned about what's happening in higher education across California that you didn't expect?
One, in the course of doing having the task force, we interviewed some 200 people, roughly half of whom were students. I think we interviewed about 85 college students, and then we also interviewed some high school students. And one issue that really bubbled up to the top for many of these students was that they did not feel a sense of belonging on their campuses. And so we actually, one of the buckets of recommendations that we have is about how do we foster inclusive institutions, which is why I asked you the question about where students feel a sense of belonging, because many students don't quite feel like they belong. I think some of that is getting to campus and trying to figure out how do you find your tribe. I think some of that has to do with some structural elements that we have within higher education that inadvertently otherize people, if you will. So one recommendation that we have in our report is how can we streamline the services that students with less resources are eligible for and entitled to. Right now, we inadvertently ask students to show us time and time again how poor they are in order to access services and resources. You have to show on your FAFSA, you oftentimes are going to a food pantry, you may not have money and you have to get a bus pass, you have to apply for emergency aid. Like, we have all of these things. We have enormous food and housing insecurity in this state. And I think that we would do a better job of having students feel included if we didn't have to ask them time and time again to show us that they didn't belong, right? And in fact, so I'm trying to think about how can we start to streamline and potentially centralize the process for applying for benefits. Can you, if a student is a 12th grader and they are on free and reduced lunch, is it possible for us to feed that information to their college early on and pre-enroll them in CalFresh so that they don't have to go without food for 6, 8, 12 weeks when they start college? It's those kinds of things that I feel like we as a state could probably do a better job of, working in partnership, obviously, with the higher education institutions. So those are some of the things, just really underscoring what it means to feel a sense of belonging. Students talked a lot about wanting to have a faculty that is much more reflective of their backgrounds, and not just that, but to see their cultures and experiences more integrated into the curricula, right? So that they're not just studying Homer, but that there are opportunities to study what is happening potentially here in California, the history of California, the history of Indigenous people in this state. So I think that really rung out to me as we went through the task force.
That's really powerful. And I think that, one of the quotes one of my favorite quotes, I think it was Horace Mann, but I'm not sure. Honestly, I've repeated it so many times, I'm not sure. But that notion of higher education as the great equalizer, I think I believe that. I mean, it's part of why I do what I do. I suspect it's part of why you do what you do. But one of the challenges within that is right now, higher education often reinforces societal divisions rather than bridges them. And I think a lot of times it's for the exact reasons that you were outlining. It's because we have a notion of who belongs here, and it's not necessarily as inclusive as we need it to be. Higher education can be the great equalizer if students get through. They often do extraordinarily well. But that path and those hurdles are bigger for students, especially if they're first generation students or underrepresented students. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to address that. And I think we can learn a lot from the work of the task.
Yeah.
I also know.
I was just going to say, going back to your work, I actually think it's one of the tremendous benefits of a small liberal arts college, a residential college. Many of these residential colleges require students to live on campus their first year, and maybe sometimes longer than that. And so it puts you in community with people who are not like you. And that is actually exactly the genesis of social progress, right? It is about learning to engage people who are not like you, to appreciate that people have different values, they have different understandings, and that actually bringing those pieces together and then forging a collective sense of what the future will be is how we actually architect social progress. And that is, I think, the what's core and essential about, in many ways, the small college, is that it allows students to have the experience of doing that in residential communities oftentimes, and to internalize that in ways that they can carry that with them into their lives.
Yeah, it's absolutely right. When I first looked at Dominican and came to campus, I knew it was a highly diverse student body. What I was really interested in was when I walked into the lunchroom, were students actually within that diversity kind of mixing, or were they in a bunch of subgroups? And I think we're a small enough campus with enough overlapping things that they were definitely integrated. Now, I think it was more like the nursing students are over here because they just got out of class or they've got an exam coming up and that kind of thing. But it was not, it wasn't, to use the old term, it wasn't balkanized. And that was really important to me. Having said that, we've got to, we're not perfect on the subject at all, but I think engaging the question and leaning into the question is important. And part of what I try and outline in the book is the institutions that have been successful at reinventing themselves. I mentioned mission before. They also start with the students. It's like, who are our students and who are they going to be? And how can we be successful with them? How can we be successful for them, I should say. So that ends up being, I think, the commonality. I'm interested, we've had stimulus bills. We've certainly read a lot about, a lot of industries really suffering through the pandemic. Could you talk a little bit about what you learned in the task force of what higher education institutions have been through and some of the work that you all have done to try and help us with that? Because you've been extraordinarily helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the institutions themselves had to make very deep investments in both faculty and students in ways in which they weren't planning to do. A lot of that ended up being around technology initially, and I was really pleased to see the deep investment that was made in the professional development of faculty so that they could actually have a broader set of tools and skills to be able to teach effectively in a distance learning format. There was an all-out effort at so many institutions to make sure that every student had a device, and not just a device, but adequate internet access. And I think one of the huge findings over the last year is just how much there is still a digital divide in this state, and the need for broadband as almost a civil right in order for folks to be able to meaningfully participate in society. If you don't have broadband right now, it's going to be really hard for you to get on My Turn and get your vaccination. You're not doing telehealth. You're not taking courses distance courses. There's just a lot that's really dependent on access to technology, and we have to do a better job to make sure that every Californian has that. So I think that those were some of the pieces, and we really wanted to help the colleges themselves try to manage that turmoil. One other thing that happened is, people don't really understand the finances of how colleges work, but there's so much that's baked into a college budget, right, that there's no flexibility around, as you well know. One of the few places that there's a little bit of revenue is around housing and dining services. And part of what happened with many of our colleges is that as students moved out, those revenue sources were just cut off, right? And that left a huge hole amongst just needing to, do testing on campus and all the other things that needed to happen, left a huge hole in many budgets. And then we had students who were unsure about what was going to happen. And we saw in some institutions a decline in enrollment. And, again, if you want to get inside the spreadsheet and understand the budget of a college, the marginal cost for every student who decides to defer is huge in terms of a college budget. So I think what we were trying to do is just to make sure, as we were supporting students, that we were making sure that students had the financial aid that they needed, and that the financial aid that went to the college got there, that no student was, all out prevented or precluded from being able to pursue their education, and to partner with the colleges in that endeavor. So I'm looking at the time and realizing we're getting behind, and there are lots of questions coming, but I wanted to let you have your last.
All right. I'll respond to that, and then we'll dive into questions. A couple of quick stories, actually. One is I was talking to one of our alums the other day who talked about going by, she was on a road trip, and she was driving through somewhere in the Central Valley, and she saw a whole bunch of like 20, 25 young people gathered outside of McDonald's, all on their screens. And she realized, because she stopped, got a cup of coffee, that was where they got their Wi-Fi, right? So they could be at class.
Yep.
So that issue is profound.
Yeah.
The related pieces, we offered free laptops to students who needed them last year. They went like that. More so than the housing piece, we offered housing to students who didn't have someplace else to go. And some of them didn't have easy places to go and, buddied up with their friends, but it was actually the digital divide that was the most profound for our students.
I'm wondering how you are thinking about outcomes from college. Increasingly, one of the things that we have seen is, and I think that this really has to do with the cost of college and how it has increased so dramatically. But people really measure outcomes of college now in jobs and what kind of job you're prepared to get. And I'm wondering, are there qualitative ways that people should be thinking about measuring outcomes, and in terms of quality of life, engagement in one's community? And if that is the case, if it goes beyond a job and a salary, how do we think about the cost benefit? How do we think about the ROI and how much you should invest for those kinds of outcomes?
Yeah. Look, higher education isn't the answer to everything, right? It can't make you happy if you're unhappy necessarily, but it can, I think, provide an avenue to a meaningful and engaged life. And one of the things that I frequently reference is Freud said we all need love and work, but I think we need love and meaningful work. And ideally, higher education helps you find your voice. It helps you find your calling and who you are meant to be in the world. And if you do that, then you find out also what your capacity is to contribute in those ways. But I think one of the things that we've done almost too good a job of is talked about higher education as that return on investment. And, I quoted a lovely statistic by campus, it looked great. It is a big return on investment. But we should not miss that, this country was founded, there's been a firm belief that education is part of having an educated citizenry, mm-hmm. and that's essential to a functioning democracy. And so those questions we were talking about earlier, for example, about cancel culture become crucial. It also goes back to, is a student experience about more than just themselves? So I think the stakes feel so high that we focus very much on the individual student, but ultimately it's society that has an investment and a stake in this. And, one of the things that the Newsom administration helped us with that I think has got great potential for California, has had a nice start, is something called the Civic Action Fellows, where students get a scholarship support from the institution. They get some AmeriCorps funding through California Volunteers, and they do civic action work as a part of their higher education, and they get academic credit for it. That's a model that says students can do meaningful work on behalf of others as well as themselves when they're in college. And that's something that I hope that they take away, well beyond college, that it's about contributing and giving back. If you've had the opportunity, it shouldn't be just that you're a good person and you want to, possibly give back to others. It should be built in, kind of baked into the higher education experience.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I'm very mindful that it is 30th of March, which means, almost all the colleges are notifying applicants. This is where students are making decisions. It's also the season where many, many, many high school juniors are beginning their process to look at college. What advice do you have for a family or for students who are starting that process, given the pandemic, given where we are as a culture, given the cost of college? Where should they start? What should they be holding as important as they start upon that journey?
Yeah, it is a high stakes time, and it's really tough to not be able to have campus visits, I think, for families and for the youth. So there are a couple of places that I would suggest you start. And one of the things I would turn on its head is the pandemic itself. It has created so many hurdles, but it also creates, I think, for parents and students, an opportunity to say, how did they handle that, right? So, look at the retention rates of the last year. Look at whether it varies by, the particular major, the particular group that you're interested in. Look at the what happens to students, not just 6 months out, but a year out, 5 years out. There's a lot of data about this, and even over the course of a lifetime. There was a really interesting study that came out just a couple of years ago by something called the Equality of Opportunity Project out of Stanford. And they looked at, you can do this with big data now. They looked at all the colleges and universities in the United States and said, are you able to move the needle? It's not just how are you doing for all of your students, but for students that start in the lower socioeconomic quartile, are they moving up or not? So look at information like that, because I think sometimes there are real surprises in that data about what institutions are doing well. It's not always what you think it is. It's not always, here's a brand name that's going to look great in a bumper sticker. A lot of times it's institutions that are particularly good at a niche that you may be interested in. I also want to go back, the question of cost. It's another place, because it's a complicated system, where there's often surprises. So it's not only how much am I paying right now with financial aid and whatever scholarships I can get, how long does it take to get a degree? If it's going to take me 6 or 7 years to get a degree, then you have to, that's going to cost that much more over time. Or is it important for me to get through in 4 years, get out, get into the workforce or get into graduate school? Then maybe I'm looking at a different type of institution. And then I think one of the most important things to look at is, you talk about student success after graduation, but what's the retention rate? Do students stay? Because there's a lot of churn in higher education. There's a lot of students that start in one place and transfer elsewhere. They start and they drop out. I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we share, actually, Londe, is across the state and within institutions, is how do we create a safety net so students aren't lost? But for students and their families looking right now, what's the success rate of students in not only getting in, but getting out and getting out with a degree?
So where do things like prestige and college rankings fit in all of that?
Well, I think that they are nice for bumper stickers. Absolutely. You and I both have at least one top degree, right? So we know that there's value there. But having said that, I mean, as a college president, I have to say that they make you a little crazy because they tend to measure. We were just talking about look at what happens, not just getting in. The rankings tend to measure wealth, right? So the richest institutions are also the ones that rank the highest. But that doesn't align with what happens to students necessarily. So they are a very blunt instrument that is, mostly about reinforcing status. What I often say is, there's 50 institutions in the country that want to be in the top 10. Most of the top 10 is not going anywhere, and no one really cares if you're 37th or 26th, except for you in a small circle within your institution. So I know that I understand the interest in the guides, right? It's because it's a complex system and it's kind of opaque. I think we're getting better at, instead of saying we're competing against X, just saying this, what I want from higher education is for us to say with confidence, this is our role, this is what we do, and we do it extraordinarily well. That's easier at a small college, but I feel like that's what we try and do at Dominican. We're about mission. We're really clear about what we do well. And that doesn't mean that it's for everybody. It means that if you think you belong here, you probably do. And we're going to do right by you. But that's different than, is this a name that everybody around the country is going to recognize and say, hoorah. And I think that's part of what folks need to navigate.
That's great. Well, we are now at the point in our program where there is time for only one more question. And one of our viewers has asked, what motivates you personally in your professional role?
I'm guessing it's a little bit of what motivates you. So I'm gonna start, but I may turn the tables on you a little bit here. I grew up on a cattle ranch, the real thing in Nebraska. Town had 600 people in it. I literally started out at a one-room country schoolhouse. And I went to the big public institution of the state. I went to the University of Nebraska because if you went to college, that's where you went if you were in Nebraska. I happened to stumble across a faculty member and a staff member who really believed in me and encouraged me to apply to graduate school. And so I ended up at Oxford. I'd never been overseas. I'd never been out of the country. I'd barely been out of a 4 or 5 state region in the middle of the country. Now, there's nothing wrong with being on a cattle ranch in Nebraska. My family is there now, and they do a great job. I didn't belong there. And I would never have found a way to contribute to the world without the opportunity of higher education. And so to me, when I said, I hope students find their calling, I know it's because I found my calling through higher education. And I deeply believe in the purpose and the mission, imperfect as we are. And so I don't know if that resonates with you at all, Londe, but I think you may have had some opportunities through higher education as well.
I have. I wouldn't be sitting in this job had it not been for the opportunities of higher education. My mom came to the United States. She was an immigrant from Nigeria and came to the United States for an education, and all of her children have gone to college, and 3 out of 4 of us have gone to graduate school. And it is because of that desire for education that we find ourselves able to live the good life, right? To be able to afford to live in California, to be able to, ensure that our kids are educated. There's just so much. I feel so fortunate to have my education, and fortunate to be able to now be a part of the governor's team to help ensure that every other student who comes from fairly modest backgrounds also has the promise of higher education. So, well, Dr. Marcy, I want to thank you for your time. As you all know, Dr. Mary Marcy is president of Dominican University of California and author of the new book, The Small College Imperative: Models for Sustainable Futures, which is available at your local bookstore and online. We also want to thank you, our viewers. I am Dr. Londe Ajose, Senior Policy Advisor for Governor Gavin Newsom. And now this program of the Commonwealth Club is adjourned.